Welcome to the Kids Eating Broccoli podcast, where we believe that raising healthy kids shouldn't be complicated. Our mission is to inspire 20 million families worldwide to take the steps to raise the healthiest generation in our history. We'll interview some of the world's leading experts in nutrition, human potential, and children's health, as well as extraordinary chefs and foodies to gain insight into simple, fun, and creative ways to introduce natural health into homes across this planet. Hi there, welcome to the next episode of the Kids Eating Broccoli podcast. Today we continue on with our special series about ADD and ADHD, and our guest today is Dr. Andrea Nazarenko. She received her PhD in clinical community psychology from the University of South Carolina, where she studied youth development and environmental factors that facilitate or hinder positive development. Broadly, her research focuses on contextual factors that affect behavioral problems in youth and adolescents, research methodology, and ways to bridge the gap between what we know in research and what we do in practice. She also has 3 master's degrees, the first in psychology and education from Columbia University in New York, where she studied risk and resilience in youth, the second in applied statistics, and the third in clinical community psychology from University of South Carolina. One of Dr. Andrea's areas of expertise is in the area of youth behavior problems, with both extensive research and clinical background with youth displaying a range of behavioral problems, from children on the autistic spectrum displaying organic behavior problems, to teens and adults incarcerated for serious and violent crimes, and everything in between. In particular, she has a long history of assessment, diagnosis, and treatment of youth with ADHD. Most recently, she worked as a methodologist on an NIH-funded grant examining social behavior in children with ADHD, and on a project examining substance use patterns among college students with ADHD. Dr. Andrea's motivation behind the study of ADHD is to understand natural and sustainable solutions to behavioral problems. Along with her husband, Dr. Eric Nazarenko, DC, Dr. Andrea founded Treehouse Living, a wellness company focused on empowering parents to live a holistic lifestyle. Through this initiative, she spreads her love and passion for supporting the physical and emotional health of all children. I asked Dr. Andrea to join us because of her vast expertise and experience with kids with ADHD and coming from the psychology side of things. So this was an awesome interview, and I hope you enjoy. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Andrea, today on the Kids Eating Broccoli. We really appreciate you taking your time with us. So I'd love to start by just asking you to tell us a little bit about you, some of your background story of how you got to where you are today, and some of the focuses of your work.
Sure. I'm Dr. Andrea Nazarenko. I received my PhD in clinical community psychology from the University of South Carolina. And most people wonder what community psychology is. Community psychology and community psychologists believe that children, in this case, children with ADHD, and individuals are not just, clinical problems with individuals, but rather behavior and mental processes are products of our environment and our systems. And so if we could change our systems, we could change human behavior and individuals' behavior. So this is a really big passion of mine. I'm really interested in changing systems and changing the way our world works to better support youth development and adults in our society. I received like I said, my PhD in clinical community psychology. I also have 3 master's degrees. One, my first one was from Columbia University in psychology and education. My second was in applied statistics, and my third was in clinical community psychology. Throughout all of my training, I've been incredibly interested in youth with behavioral problems. So ADHD goes right aligned with that. I have worked with everyone from little kids who are showing signs of autism all the way through adults and teens who are in jails for serious and violent crimes, gang behavior, homicide, you name it. And I've worked and researched in those areas. Most recently, I've done some work with social behavior with ADHD and substance abuse with college students who have ADHD. So that's my academic background. My personal background is that I have two little kids, a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I'm a mom, and I'm trying to raise these kids in a healthy lifestyle. My husband is a chiropractor. We own a wellness center in the Midlands in South Carolina, where we really focus on teaching families how to raise emotionally and physically healthy children. We started an empowerment company, Treehouse Living, where we are focused on driving this mission home and passionate about teaching families sustainable and easy ways to integrate health into their lifestyle. And when we talk about health, we talk about behaviors, we talk about emotions and physical health. They're all hand in hand. And so that's really where my passion is. That's what I'm about. And that's what brings me here today.
Awesome. Well, that sounds really cool what you guys are up to with your Treehouse Living. And that's exciting. So I'd love to just kind of launch into our material, like you alluded to when you were just mentioning the ADHD connection, because it's October and that's ADHD Awareness Month. And so on our Kids Eating Broccoli for this month, we're really focusing on ADHD and what parents can do and what other caregivers can do to really support their kids, help them. Of course, because our focus is on wellness, health, healthy families, we're really looking for what are the best alternatives or things you can do that aren't going down the road of medication.
Right.
Because in my work and talking to parents, I have found that, I haven't really found any parent that thinks I really want to give my kids drugs. They, not to say there aren't that make that choice, but that typically that's because they don't feel like there's another viable solution. And so, I brought Dr. Andrea on today to really share some of her expertise. And in the pre-chat, we were talking about not only what you can do, but I'd love for you to share a little bit, Dr. Andrea, about why, making nutrition or dietary changes even is part of the process with ADHD and how the kids' brains are functioning and those type of things. So if you could tell us about that.
Yeah, it's a really great question, because much of what we think of when we think of ADHD treatment these days is pharmacological, meaning drug therapy, because they have the drugs for ADHD have really taken off, and there's a reason why people have there's many reasons why these drugs have taken off, most of which are outside the scope of this podcast. But one of the reasons are that for youth with ADHD, meaning younger children, drugs are effective in the short term. Especially for short-term effects, meaning immediately you'll see attention effects. The problem with drugs, and the reason why parents are starting to question the utilization of drugs for kids with ADHD, is that they are not a long-term solution. At the sheer effectiveness level, adults who use ADHD drugs are very unlikely to see the effects that children see. They just don't affect adult brains in the same way. I think there's a statistic of about 20% of adults who take these drugs really have a benefit in reducing ADHD symptoms. Now, if you ask parents to self-report that, sometimes it's different because these drugs affect the reward centers of your brains, which is the same area that other illicit drugs. So people like taking them; they're highly addictive. When I say addictive, I mean people like them and they want to keep taking them to get the effects, not addictive in an illicit substance sort of way. But they're not really an effective long-term solution. In addition to that, they have adverse effects. The long-term health benefits of taking these drugs on a developing child's brain, especially in adolescence, has just flat out not been studied. We do not know what the health effects of these drugs are going to be in the long term. We do know that there are side effects of these medications, and they don't work in the long term. They do. An example of an adverse effect is that they increase the risk of substance use and addiction to other drugs later in life. So just, from a body system and a behavioral system, these drugs are not a long-term sustainable solution. So parents are looking for other strategies. Parents are waking up and saying that these drugs, I can't just Band-Aid behavioral problems anymore. I need to teach my child behavioral strategies that work and help their body system attend. And so, Dr. Brad, you asked this question of what does food have to do with the brain and attention systems and hyperactivity? Well, it has everything to do with it, because our attention systems and our brain systems, well, they work off of neurotransmitters. Our whole brain, our whole nervous system is functioning off of these neurotransmitters. And specifically, we're talking about serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine when we're talking about attention systems. Well, those neurotransmitters, those same neurotransmitters that are firing off, that help you attend, that help you behave, well, those are created by the vitamins, minerals, fatty acids, all the stuff we get from our diet. And so when we have a deficient diet, when we have a deficient vitamins, minerals, amino acids, etc., what we're seeing is that children's brains are not firing in the way that they should. And so you could approach this two ways. You could approach this from a pharmacological standpoint, where you put a Band-Aid on it and say your brain's not firing the same way because these neurotransmitters are firing slightly different and your sensory system is a little bit off. And that masks the symptoms, and kids feel better. And it has side effects, and it has potential long-term consequences. Or you could address the dietary aspects, which may take longer to see an effect. You might not see that immediate short-term couple hours later effect, but when you change the lifestyle, you start to see these changes in ADHD as well, because you're addressing the cause of why the attentional problems and the hyperactivity exist. So it's a direct relationship between what you're putting in your body and what you're getting out of your body, and it's a different approach to reducing the symptoms that we see. That being said, I think there's an important clause here that we could throw in there, in that the etiology or the cause of ADHD is largely unknown. We know things increase the risk of ADHD. We know things decrease the risk. What we know is that there's a genetic component and there's a strong environmental component. But by talking about diet and talking about how diet could improve symptoms, we're not talking about causation. We're not saying that what you fed your child caused them to have ADHD. We have a lot of pressure on ourselves. Like I said, I'm a mom of 2 little kids. There's a lot of pressure on ourselves to be the best parents we could be. So I want to alleviate any concerns up front that I'm not talking about any individual parent causing their child's symptoms, but rather alternative solutions to help their children in long-term ways that promote overall health rather than immediate symptom relief.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a valuable point as well, to put out there. And I think that, in a lot of the work we do in the Kids Eating Broccoli podcast and Kids Eating Broccoli project in general has to do with, typically, of course, our listeners are parents who are, interested in natural solutions, interested in the health of their kids, interested in doing what they can to help improve that. And what I found is sort of the two sides of that are, on the one hand, we have parents who've done, who find, have done a research or whatever the case may be to consider themselves to know, what's healthy and what's not healthy. And they have a challenge implementing it, right? Like getting their kids to accept that reality and change their behavior in a lot of cases. And then on the other hand, parents who feel like, I don't even know where to start. It's like, I want this. Mm-hmm. I get it, that it's valuable and important, but I go, online, or I go to bookstores if they still have those things, and this person says one thing and then this person says the opposite of what that person's saying. And it becomes a very confusing situation. Like, how do you even start? And so a lot of those times, they throw their hands up. Mm-hmm. And so part of my goal in this is to really be a voice of, reason within that, and to give some usable, actionable items. And you mentioned in your intro about wanting to create things that are easy. And I mean, there's certainly value in that, but more than easy is what I think of as things that are, you can actually implement, right. And in a stepwise process. And so speaking of on the second hand, what would you say then if a parent, comes to you or I'm asking you, I have this kid, I get it that we need to make some changes to their eating. Their eating is horrible. And I know that's affecting, their brain and their attention. So what are the first steps that I can do as somebody who's never really done that nutrition, like we eat just a standard American diet? Where do I begin?
Yeah. And, I love what you just said there about going into a bookstore or looking on the internet and getting all this contradictory information, because it's so true. I mean, even in the realm of ADHD and diet, you're talking about studies that trace back to the 70s, which in the land of research is a humongous amount of time in terms of the last time some of these studies were done. Now, there is a lot of new research as well, but sometimes those things conflict. And so how do you listen to it? So I'm going to distill a lot of that for you today. I'm going to let you know there's two main buckets we talk about when we think about ADHD and diet. The first main bucket is removing things that could potentially be contributing to ADHD symptomology. So these are things like artificial food colors and dyes, additives, preservatives, sugar, and then elimination diets. And I'm going to talk about each one of those in a little bit of detail in a minute. The second big bucket to add in terms of ADHD and diet is the addition of foods. So these are things like vitamins, minerals, and amino acids or essential fatty acids that help your body regulate. And I alluded a little bit to that a few minutes ago. But let's first start with this idea of what to remove from kids' diets. Potentially the oldest study, and these are the studies that started in the 70s, and I find this so interesting that in the 70s people were talking about food additives and colors and how they affect behavior, because in the 70s, while we did have food additives, while we did have kids with ADHD, the problem was nowhere near what it is now. And yet we've just continued to do it. So we've known something for a long time, but we really haven't implemented it in the ways we should. And so what we see is that the more diets with more food colorings, additives, preservatives, these are they impact ADHD, in maladaptive ways. So you want to try to eliminate as many artificial foods as possible. So what does that mean? That means any foods with dyes, with preservatives, with color. You want to go back to whether or not you have a child with ADHD or not ADHD. You want to feed them whole foods, not processed foods. A lot of the studies that have looked at this, have been done previously, but the basic idea, previously meaning in the 70s, the basic idea was that artificial food colorants may make your child more hyperactive. And so removing those would improve the symptoms. These studies have led to the EU, European Union, actually placing warnings on many foods with these particular dyes, informing parents that, hey, if your kid eats this food, you may see problems, adverse effects with their behavioral patterns and attention. I mean, this is not brand new information. This isn't stuff that's really debated. We have a hard time in this country accepting those types of messages, but other countries are doing it where these foods are not good for you, especially if you have ADHD. The second big bucket within this removal of foods is this notion of sugar. Now, there's a caveat that I'm going to throw out here in relation to sugar, in that excessive sugar, especially in processed foods, not natural sources of sugar like fruit, are not good for development in general. They lead to inflammation, and if you're living a healthy lifestyle, you want to reduce the amount of sugar you're consuming. In relation to the notion that something you often hear parents say is that, oh, that child doesn't have ADHD, they just eat too much sugar. Or if they didn't eat that sugar, they wouldn't have ADHD. And I'm here to assure probably many parents listening to this podcast that sugar is not the reason the children have ADHD. ADHD exists. It is a sensory processing disorder in children's brains, and it's not just because they ate sugar. The question is, what role does sugar play? It likely plays a role in the immediate effect. You eat a sugary breakfast, you may have hyperactivity that follows, but taking sugar out of the diet is not necessarily something that is going to remove, research doesn't support the idea that it's going to remove your ADHD symptomology. That doesn't mean you shouldn't reduce sugar. That just means as a treatment for ADHD, it's an easy target, but it's not the only solution. The limitation of these studies is oftentimes they compare sugar to things like aspartame, and neither one of those is good. So you could take that for what it's worth. There's probably a lot of contextual factors we have to look at when we think about sugar. That's what the research says. As a mom, I probably am not going to feed my child too much sugar. So in terms of removing foods, we've got take out artificial food colors and dyes, additives, preservatives. Be cautious of sugar, anecdotally. And the last one is this idea of food elimination and intolerances. And this is something that I am so passionate about because it's just so cutting edge. So when we think about allergies and we think about food allergies, we think about an immediate response to a food. And traditionally, those are done through food tests, right? You prick your skin, you see if you have an allergic reaction. What we see with things like ADHD is that children may have an intolerance to food. So it's not an allergy that you're detecting through a traditional test, but rather they have some sort of intolerance that is not sitting well with their body. Whether they have leaky gut or they have some inflammation elsewhere in their body, for some reason, certain foods are not sitting well with them. And that intolerance can cause a whole bunch of problems systemically. And so you may see digestive issues, but you also may see mental fog, which leads to inattention, inability to sit still, all the ADHD symptoms. So there's been a whole slew of evidence and focus in research on this idea of a few foods. Now, most of this work in relation to eliminating foods has been done with very restrictive diets. And that's because a lot of the technology that we have nowadays just didn't exist yet. So this was, this few foods diet stuff started in like the 80s, early 90s, where we didn't have the same sort of technology we do now where we can detect food intolerances. And so some of the limitations and some of the hesitations for parents to do a food restrictive diet is just that it's really hard to get your kids. Dr. Brad, you talked about it earlier, like, hey, I know what I'm supposed to do, but how do I get my kid not to eat Halloween candy, right? It's just how do you fit it into your daily life? And so this area of food restriction has been a challenge for families with ADHD because we don't know, there's no clear pattern about which foods are triggering which kids. It's highly individual. And up until this point, we really were only able to identify which foods were triggering kids by eliminating everything and reintroducing things very slowly. And so this has implications on their nutritional status, whether or not, are they getting enough, vitamins, minerals, and stuff like that if they're only eating a restrictive diet for an extended period of time, how well the children adapt to this, take to it, accept it, whether it has social implications. So there's all this other stuff. But we are fortunate in 2017 because now we do have testing where we could directly test food intolerances and see which ones are creating the reactions for kids. And it makes this idea that a restrictive food diet can really impact children at an individual level. So those are the three main areas for food removal. And I mentioned,
can I just jump in here and ask?
Please.
So you mentioned that now we have the ability to test for these things without having to do the elimination. So how does one go about that? Like, who would I talk to? Where would I find that info?
There are many holistic practitioners. There's different ways to test. Many holistic practitioners do offer this type of testing. You would look for IgG responses or IgA responses. At Treehouse Living, we do it. We could do it virtually. It's blood work that we would, you would get our kit and get your blood drawn, and then, I just got mine the other day, and then am on a protocol for myself. I eat healthy. I live a healthy lifestyle, and yet still there's foods in my environment that trigger me, and so I'm personally doing this myself.
Great. And let me ask you one other thing on that, and then we'll get back to where we were going next. Because I hear a lot of sort of conflicting ideas about food intolerance, food allergies, that type of thing. Is it, do you find that it's typically once they're identified and we start removing them and then continue to make healthy changes, that then they can be reintroduced later? Is that something that people can look forward to, or it's kind of like I'm intolerant to eggs and forget it, I can never eat those again?
It's a really great question. And I think that question is just right at the cusp of what we know about food intolerances. There is this idea previously that if you're intolerant to all of these foods, you can't reintroduce them again. What the current movement is towards is that if you are intolerant to food, especially if you're, let me take one step backwards. Oftentimes what we see in Treehouse with the tests that we do and the people we've worked with is that oftentimes it's the case that folks have a leaky gut, which means that their intestinal permeability is letting out nutrients and particles into the bloodstream that are not supposed to be there. That in a healthy individual, the different particles and molecules stay within the gut lining, but for various reasons, the gaps in the intestinal lining grow larger and allow for other substances to get into the bloodstream. And when this happens, our bodies respond because our bodies respond to invaders. And in this case, the invader is a food source. And so what we see are these children and adults with all of these food tolerances that I wouldn't classify as real food intolerances, rather the result of the leaky gut. So if you heal the gut, which we have protocols for doing, you can then reintroduce the foods back in. In the traditional way of removing everything and just having a few foods, what we see are huge response rates. So in terms of ADHD symptoms, we see 64 to 73% of children respond to this type of treatment, which statistically is what children respond to medication with. So these are huge response rates that we're seeing by eliminating the triggering foods. So it is probably true that for some children with some foods, they may need to eliminate it for life. But for others, they may need to heal the gut or deal with whatever is leading to the food intolerance, and then they could try to reintroduce them and, work with a holistic practitioner, a chiropractor, to figure out what's triggering the food and what's triggering the reaction.
Gotcha. And then
it could take about a year to really figure out and identify as you're reintroducing foods back in if it's affecting you.
Gotcha. You mean a year symptomatically? Or what do you mean by...
a year, so if you did not do blood testing, if you just said, I'm going to eliminate all these foods and then reintroduce one by one over the course of time, you'd introduce milk, for example, and then wait 2 weeks and see if you showed any symptoms, then introduce something else and go back and forth. So before you could, without any blood tests, identify it, it's about a year. But with the blood test, it expedites that much faster.
Sure, sounds like it. And so is there a... So then, putting myself in the shoes of, the parent who's has kids that are wanting to help, how do we know, or is that a more involved question about whether the cause is leaky gut or something else?
Yeah. So you could test for leaky gut.
Oh, okay.
Again, it's a blood test, and they'll test for different, reactions in your blood that indicate if it's intestinal permeability.
Okay.
And this is cutting edge stuff. I mean, this didn't exist 5 years ago, 3 years ago. This is really brand new. And so it really facilitates healing in a lot of families that have situations like this.
Yeah, well, that's cool too, because I think I certainly have heard over the years people say, when the subject is brought up, they're like, oh, I had the test and I'm not allergic to this and this or these things. And to first understand this distinction you're making with allergy versus intolerance, and then also to realize that unless they've had it tested in this really specific new way, that they don't know. I mean, we just don't know because the other test was insufficient. So that's really good to know.
And a lot of it was trial and error. Like, let's try cutting all this stuff out and see what happens. Right. And it's, the field is moving fast, which is really wonderful for families and responding to our demands.
Cool. All right. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. So then I was going to jump to my other big bucket. So the first big bucket was remove the bad stuff. And the next big bucket is introduce in the good stuff. So what is the good stuff we're talking about? They are amino acids, essential fatty acids, so DHA, EPA, vitamins, and minerals. And what do we know about these four areas? Well, let's start off with the essential fatty acids, because it's probably the one we know the most about. So essential fatty acids, these are fish oils, right? Commonly, they're the DHA, EPA. They're the ones you took when you were pregnant because why? They helped babies' brain development. They helped cognitive functioning, right? These are the things they helped your brain development, your brain function, your cognitive functioning, emotional control, all of the same areas that are targeted in ADHD. They have anti-inflammatory effects on your whole nervous system. Your nervous system is implicated in ADHD. And studies with rats and animal studies, a lot of what we know comes from animal studies. We see that when they have deficiencies in these essential fatty acids, they show signs similar to ADHD, right? Their neural firing is the same way. And so the essential fatty acids are largely implicated in ADHD, such that kids with ADHD are deficient in them. And here is it's incredibly interesting to me, this point that I'm about to make. While children with ADHD are deficient in essential fatty acids, their intake of the fatty acids is not different than non-ADHD kids. So what does that mean? It means they're consuming potentially the same diets, though there is indication that some diets are different, but they're consuming the same amount of these essential fatty acids. However, the processing and metabolism of these fatty acids is different for a child with ADHD. So there's multiple reasons why this may be. It could be from the conversion. So there's precursors to these fatty acids. Alpha-linoleic acid is one of them. So there could be a problem with the conversion of these precursors to the fatty acids. There's genetic influences. There are gender influences where testosterone gets in the way of the production or the metabolism of these fatty acids. And that could explain partially why we see a huge gender effect in ADHD. But the main story across this body of research is that children with ADHD just may require, one, a larger amount of the precursors to obtain these long-chain fatty acids. So these are things like ALA or alpha-linoleic acid. They may have less efficient metabolism of it. And so taking more supplementation of your fatty acids, your DHA and your EPA is strongly recommended. So these are your fish oils. Normal dosages you see are likely insufficient for your child. So the recommendations in the literature are high doses, like a gram or two of EPA every day. Which is much higher than you're just going to see in your child's multivitamin. So even though your neighbor might take that much and you could say, yeah, I'm taking, my EPA, it's not sufficient to make the change in your child. And so increase the dose and see if it helps. I find that really interesting that it's not just, and plant oils, another question is whether plant oils will do the same thing. Plant oils don't have the same support as the fish oils do. Fish oils are much more effective at reducing ADHD symptoms, and we see that kids with ADHD have deficiency in essential fatty acids. Similarly, we see deficiencies in vitamins and minerals. So there is the vitamin literature is a little bit tougher to decipher because the way it's done is by introducing these mega doses of vitamins into kids, and mega doses are not the way that we typically function. And so there's not that much could be distilled from the vitamin literature. However, minerals, there's a lot to suggest that zinc may be largely implicated in ADHD. So taking zinc supplementation may be very beneficial, especially if you are a child with a deficiency. So if you don't have a zinc deficiency, you probably won't get a benefit from taking more zinc. But if you are deficient, which many children with ADHD are, it will help your attentional systems. Too much could cause side effects. So if you don't need it, don't take it. But try it out. See if it helps your child. because and if you live in an area where there is a lot of zinc deficiency, then you might also want, because of nutritional sources, you might want to take that. Do you have any questions on that? Amino acids I forgot to talk about. And I referenced this earlier in that the way diet affects the brain is through acting on the neurotransmitters. So we're talking about dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. These are the neurotransmitters in the brain that are implicated in ADHD. They're your attentional systems, your hyperactivity. They are synthesized by precursors. They're synthesized. We create those neurotransmitters by feeding our body amino acids. And so there's some evidence that by taking things like tryptophan, you could increase the neurotransmitters in your brain and therefore decrease symptoms of ADHD. But it's an area that more work is needed for sure.
Gotcha. So I think I have two questions, but one, you mentioned with the zinc, which was an interesting point, because we often hear, take this supplement, take that supplement, or give your kids these things, and that might help. But what I thought was interesting you were pointing out is that that'll only actually help if your kid is deficient in that.
Yeah.
And that taking more of something that you're already sufficient in isn't going to benefit you at all. And I don't know that I have a question as much as just wanting to re-highlight that point, because that's a reality that I think in this sort of pop a pill culture that we are, it's like if a little's good, more must be better, type of thing. And so we have these stores like, I don't know what you have on the East Coast, but super supplements or Vitamin Shop, which, in themselves are fine. They serve a need, but it's like row after row after row of all these supplements. And, they all seem like they must be good for you, type of thing. And so
the advertising looks so great.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But I guess the other question I had, you mentioned with the essential fatty acids about plant sources. So are you saying that how do I phrase it? There's no way to make that enough? Or if you didn't want to, give your kid fish oil for whatever reason, that you could give them enough of the plant stuff, you just have to give them a whole bunch more?
A lot of the plant oils are providing more of the linoleic acids or alpha linoleic acid. And while I did state quickly in the passing that one of the problems with essential fatty acid may be the conversion from the alpha linoleic acid to the EPA or DHA is problematic. And so if that conversion is where the problem is, just giving more alpha linoleic acid is not doing anything. This isn't like there's this huge substantial literature behind it. It's fairly small, but it's pretty conclusive that giving more plant-based oils is not helping ADHD symptoms. It's addressing it's introducing different fatty acids, but not the ones that are really implicated in ADHD. Gotcha. So they may be helpful for your child. I'm not saying plant oils are not good for you. It's just not strongly implicated in ADHD.
Okay, gotcha.
I wanted to respond to your point a minute ago about zinc and not giving more, though, because I should have given this caveat at the beginning in that every child with ADHD is different. We like to believe that there is this diagnosis called ADHD that is this one thing. And if we could find that one pill, we would be able to just resolve all of this. But that is just not the nature of this disorder. There are subtypes of ADHD, and even within subtypes, children are children. They're unique, they're individual, and each child's body and personality is special. And so when we start to talk about foods and diet, these are individual things, and what helps one child may not help the other child. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about a drug and which drug people respond to, or you're talking about the foods that they eat and what your child responds to. So some children may need zinc, and some children may need to reduce artificial food colors and dyes, and some children may need to do all of the above. Some may have an intolerance, but it's through figuring it out and trial and error with your child that you'll figure out the things that really help them.
Cool. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to move on to a putting it all together topic. Okay.
That's exactly what I was going to ask.
Look at that. So I have just sort of spit out a whole slew of information here. And if you're listening, I know if I was listening, my head would be circling around saying, okay, so here's all of these ingredients to a puzzle. How do I put it all together? And so let me ease your concerns a little bit and say that it's about lifestyle. It's about choosing a diet and a dietary lifestyle that supports these things. And there are evidence-based diets and dietary lifestyles that capture all of the stuff that we're talking about today without you having to think about all the individual ingredients. So you could eat the proverbial cake without worrying about every single ingredient that's inside. And so I'm going to highlight two and suggest a third. The first is a ketogenic diet. So ketogenic diets are high fat, adequate proteins, low carbohydrate diets. They show huge positive impacts with kids with ADHD. So kids with ADHD talk about being able to attend better and behave better when they're on a ketogenic diet. What a beautiful thing is now on the market, there's exogenous ketones where adults and children could drink them. And while that is not yet researched, certainly not FDA approved as a treatment for ADHD, anecdotally people find effects, and it's because you're going into a state of ketosis, which is linked with ADHD. The second is a Mediterranean diet. So a Mediterranean diet is well researched. This is high plants, vegetables, fishes, low, artificial colors, processed foods, all that junk. Mediterranean diets, oils, stuff like that, hugely implicated in ADHD, so that if you're on one of these diets, you see far less ADHD. The prevalence of children with ADHD who follow strict adherence to a Mediterranean diet is much lower. Those are the two big dietary lifestyles that you could look into that suggest that would help ADHD. The third is less researched. However, it's a great diet, and that is a paleo diet. It follows all of the big buckets that I talked to today. If you're following a paleo diet, you could sort of check those off your list. It's not researched directly in relation to ADHD, but there's no reason to believe that it wouldn't be beneficial for kids with ADHD.
Yeah. So the thing that ties all three of those together in part is that it's eating actual food.
Yeah, real food.
Yeah, start there, right?
The answer is so simple and yet so challenging at the same time.
Well, I appreciate so much all that you've shared. I wonder, I would be thinking, how do I learn more? How do I find you? Where do I, how can I get in touch with you? So why don't you tell us how we do that?
Yeah, so Treehouse Living, we have a very active social media page. You can find us at Drs. Andrea and Eric's Treehouse. It's a place for holistic parents. We talk about diet. We talk about parenting. We talk about gentle parenting. We talk about health. We cover the gamut of holistic parenting. And so please come find us there. We also have a Facebook page that is focused on celebrating all kids. So this is a place for parents of children with ADHD, sensory processing disorder, autism, to really celebrate the uniqueness of their child and not focus so much on why and how this is a deficit, but rather they're unique children who have beautiful benefits, and we honor all children. So you can find us in those places. We have blogs and other things that could provide more information about the things we talked about, but the best contact is through those social media.
And what was the name of the second one you mentioned? The second
Celebrating All Children.
That's what it's called. Okay, great.
Yeah, it's called All Children.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. You gave us a ton to learn and digest and start to put into place. And so I really appreciate you taking your time today and giving your expertise to us.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye now. If you enjoyed this episode of Kids Eating Broccoli podcast, connect with us online. You can find us on Facebook at Kids Eating Broccoli Podcast or at Dr. Brad Ellisor DC. You can also go to our website, drellisor.com, That's DOCTORELLISOR.com. Go to iTunes and leave us a review and a rating, or on Stitcher. And be sure to keep in touch with us so you can hear the next episode. Sign up for our mailing list or like us on Facebook. You guys take care now, and let's make the next generation the best generation.